On a quiet summer night in 1918, Russia's imperial family was awakened by a knock on the door. They were told they were being moved. That the danger outside had grown too great. But the truth was far darker. What waited for them in the basement was not protection, but a sentence already decided in secret. Moments later, gunfire echoed through the house. When it stopped, an empire that had ruled for 300 years ended in complete silence. But the bodies did not surface for decades. Why were their remains hidden? Why were two of the children buried separately? And why do eyewitness accounts of that night still contradict each other? Over a century later. Tonight, we uncover the final hours of the Romanovs, and the buried truth behind the dynasty the world was never meant to see again. In the final weeks of their lives, the Romanov family found themselves living in a world that had collapsed around them. Once surrounded by immense wealth, palaces, and ceremony, they were now confined to a small merchant's house in the remote city of Yekaterinburg. Guards watched their every move. Windows were painted over. And the former emperor of Russia was now a prisoner, waiting for a future he could no longer imagine. Inside the house, life had grown painfully quiet. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, spent their days walking in circles inside a small room, trying to stay hopeful. Their youngest brother, Alexei, grew weaker from illness, unable to leave his bed. Food was rationed. Letters were censored. And every week, new restrictions appeared without explanation. Yet despite everything, the family still believed they might survive. They prayed together. They wrote in their journals. And the guards occasionally hinted that once the civil war settled, the Romanovs would be relocated somewhere safer. For a moment, that small glimmer of hope kept them alive. But behind the scenes, a different reality was unfolding. From Moscow came secret orders. The Romanovs must not fall into enemy hands. To the revolutionary government, they were not just a family. They were a symbol, one that could inspire rebellion if rescued. Slowly, the behavior of the guards began to change. Friendly soldiers disappeared and were replaced with harsher men who refused to speak to the family. Access to the yard was denied. Newspapers were taken away. The house was reinforced, and the sound of hammering echoed through the halls at night. Nicholas wrote in his diary, "The days blend into one another. We hear gunfire at night." His once unshakable confidence had faded. For the first time, he admitted fear. Anastasia, the youngest daughter, complained of hearing footsteps in the hall long after midnight, at times when no guards were scheduled to patrol. She said she saw shadows moving outside her door, but whenever she called out, no one answered. Her family comforted her, but they could sense the tension in the air. Something was changing. By early July, rumors spread through the town that the Romanovs would soon be moved. No one knew when, or where, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. The Romanovs themselves wrote the same hopeful line in their journals over and over, "Maybe tomorrow, they will let us go." But that tomorrow never came. On their final evening, the soldiers acted strangely. They spoke in short, nervous tones. They walked through the house carrying crates and tools. The family sat together at dinner, but the room felt unbearably silent. Even the youngest children noticed that something was terribly wrong. Alexandra's hands shook as she held her cup. Nicholas tried to reassure his family, insisting that the move would be temporary. But deep down, they all sensed the truth: this was not preparation for a journey. It was preparation for an ending. As the lights went out that night, no one in the Romanov family knew that within just a few hours, their dynasty, and their lives, would be gone forever. As the civil war intensified across Russia, the fate of the Romanov family was no longer in the hands of local guards or regional officials. Their future was being decided hundreds of miles away, in the political heart of the revolution. Within the Bolshevik leadership, arguments broke out about what should be done with the former emperor and his family. Some wanted a public trial. Others argued they should be exchanged for prisoners of war. But a growing number believed there was only one solution, one that would prevent any chance of the monarchy's return. Hidden inside confidential telegrams, a new message began circulating. The Romanovs must be eliminated. The order was never officially signed by Lenin, yet numerous witnesses later insisted that the directive came from the highest level of the government. The Bolsheviks feared that if the White Army captured the city, they would liberate the Romanovs and use them as a rallying symbol to restore the monarchy. For the revolutionaries, this was an unacceptable risk. The decision, once whispered in private, soon became an irreversible plan. In Yekaterinburg, the local Soviet council received the instruction with grim determination. They formed a small group called the Special Commission, tasked with finding a way to carry out the execution without attracting attention. The entire operation had to be done quickly, quietly, and without leaving evidence that could unite the Romanov supporters. Tension grew among the guards as rumors spread about what was coming. Some soldiers, who had grown sympathetic to the family, were reassigned or removed. New guards were brought in, men loyal to the revolutionary cause, willing to follow orders without hesitation. The atmosphere in the Ipatiev house changed overnight. Conversations stopped. Laughter disappeared. The halls felt colder, as if the house itself understood what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the Romanovs remained unaware of the final decision. Nicholas continued writing in his diary as if the situation might still resolve peacefully. Alexandra wrote letters filled with optimism, convinced that the family would soon be transported to a safer location. Even the children seemed to believe the story they had been told, that the guards were preparing for their relocation. But outside the house, events were moving rapidly. The White Army was advancing toward Yekaterinburg, closing the distance day by day. If they arrived before the plan was carried out, everything the Bolsheviks feared could come true. For the Special Commission, the clock was running out. On the night of July 16, the final confirmation arrived. Guards whispered to one another as they passed through the narrow corridors, their faces pale and tight with dread. Some refused to take part. Others accepted the task without a word. One guard later recalled that the silence in the house felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. In the basement, chairs were arranged in a single line. The floor was cleared. Lamps were adjusted to cast as little shadow as possible. The preparations were clinical, controlled, almost ritualistic. The guards knew the family would not resist if they believed they were being moved, so no force was necessary, only deception. By dawn, everything was ready. The Romanovs still slept, unaware that the final order had already been issued. Unaware that the guards outside their door were rehearsing the words they would soon speak. Unaware that this would be the last morning they would ever see. The secrecy was complete. The decision was final. And the next knock on their door would seal the fate of an empire. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the Romanov family was awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. A guard opened the door and informed them that unrest in the city had grown too dangerous. For their own safety, he said, they needed to be moved to a more secure location immediately. Sleepy and confused, the family dressed quickly. Nicholas supported the frail Alexei, while the daughters helped carry small pillows and blankets they believed they might need for the journey. No one questioned the order. For months they had been told that relocation was possible. This moment, they thought, was simply that day finally arriving. The guards led them through the narrow corridor, down the stairs, and toward the basement. The room was small, dimly lit by a few lamps, and strangely bare. Chairs had been placed along one wall, arranged neatly, almost carefully. The sight was unsettling, but the family followed instructions without hesitation. Nicholas asked if more chairs could be brought for the daughters. One of the guards obliged. Another guard muttered under his breath that the room was too cramped for a photograph, echoing a lie that had been used many times before when prisoners were about to be executed. Whether the family believed it or not, they remained calm. Alexandra whispered prayers under her breath. The children looked around quietly. Even Anastasia, the most spirited of them all, seemed unusually still. Something about the room felt wrong, cold, airless, far removed from the hopeful stories they had been fed for months. But it was too late to turn back. A few moments later, the execution squad entered. Their boots scraped across the floor. Their uniforms were stiff. Some avoided eye contact entirely, staring instead at the rifles in their hands. Others trembled, their faces drained of color. None of them spoke. Finally, the commandant stepped forward and read a brief statement. The family's sentence had been decided by the Revolutionary Council. Nicholas attempted to respond, but barely managed a single word before the order was given. The room erupted into chaos. Shots rang out, echoing violently off the concrete walls. Smoke filled the air almost instantly, thick and suffocating. The confined space amplified every sound, a deafening roar of gunfire, shouts, and panicked breathing. The bullets ricocheted unpredictably, striking the walls and ceiling. The daughters, unbeknownst to their executioners, had sewn precious jewels into their clothing for safekeeping. These hidden gemstones acted like armor, causing bullets to bounce off their bodices and fall harmlessly to the floor. Confused and terrified, the guards advanced closer, firing again at point-blank range. The smoke grew so dense that the men could barely see. They shouted for ventilation, stumbled over fallen chairs, and slipped on the wet floor as they struggled to finish what they had started. It took far longer than anyone had planned. Far longer than anyone expected. What was meant to be quick became brutal and chaotic. Outside, the street remained silent. The windows of the house were sealed. No passerby knew that the fate of a dynasty was being rewritten behind those wooden walls. Inside the basement, as the smoke finally cleared, the gunfire stopped. The commanders inspected the room in grim silence. A few executioners leaned against the wall, shaking, unable to process what had just happened. In that small, suffocating basement, the Romanov dynasty, an empire 3 centuries old, came to its final, tragic end. What remained now was a second task, erasing the evidence. And that task would prove almost as complicated as the execution itself. When the execution was over, the guards faced a new problem, one they were completely unprepared for. The gunfire had been chaotic, loud, and far longer than expected. Dawn was approaching. The White Army was getting closer to the city each day. And the bodies of the Romanov family could not be left inside the house, nor buried anywhere that might later be discovered. A hasty order was given. Take the bodies into the forest. The guards wrapped the remains in bedsheets and carried them out of the basement, moving quickly under the fading night sky. They loaded the bodies into a truck and began the journey toward an abandoned mineshaft deep in the Koptyaki forest, an isolated place, away from roads, where discovery seemed impossible. But the plan began falling apart almost immediately. The truck became stuck in the mud along the forest path, delaying their progress. The weight of the bodies made the wheels sink deeper. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds. The summer air was heavy with moisture, and soon the unbearable odor of blood began to fill the truck. The guards, already exhausted and shaken from the execution, found themselves panicking under the pressure. When they finally reached the mineshaft, another problem emerged. The pit was far too shallow to hide all the bodies. To solve this, the guards attempted to destroy the remains. They poured sulfuric acid over them, hoping it would dissolve flesh and make identification impossible. They threw grenades into the mineshaft, trying to collapse the tunnel. But the explosions did little more than scatter debris and draw unwanted attention. Frustrated and desperate, the men improvised a darker plan. They decided to bury some of the bodies separately. 2 of the children, believed by historians to be Maria and Alexei, were removed from the rest and taken to a different location. Their remains were burned and buried in a shallow grave a short distance away. The separation of the bodies would later fuel one of the most persistent myths in modern history, the idea that Anastasia or Alexei might have survived. By the time the sun rose, the guards had spent hours digging, burning, covering tracks, and moving remains from place to place. Sweat dripped from their foreheads. Their clothes were stained. Some argued that the operation had been a disaster. Others insisted no one would ever find the graves. But they all agreed on one thing. The execution itself had been easier than the cover-up. Once the bodies were hidden, some in the mineshaft, others in the forest, the men scattered branches, leaves, and soil to disguise their work. They poured more acid over the graves, hoping to erase anything that the elements might reveal. Then they left, carrying with them the weight of a secret that would remain buried for decades. For the next 70 years, the Soviet government denied everything. No one spoke of the basement. No one mentioned the forest. And no one acknowledged that 2 bodies were missing. Rumors spread across the world. Some claimed the family had been rescued. Others believed 1 or more children had escaped. Newspapers published stories about surviving Romanovs living in Europe or America. But the truth remained hidden in the soil of a quiet forest outside Yekaterinburg, waiting for the right moment to surface. That moment would not come until the fall of the Soviet Union. And when it did, the discovery would change everything. For decades, the truth about the Romanovs lay hidden beneath layers of secrecy, fear, and political silence. The Soviet government denied everything. Journalists who searched for answers were turned away. Historians were discouraged from asking questions. And the official story, vague, shifting, incomplete, remained unchanged for nearly 70 years. But behind the scenes, whispers persisted. Locals spoke of suspicious activity in the Koptyaki forest. Old guards confided that something terrible had happened there. And rumors circulated that the graves were not as secure as the government believed. Everything changed in 1979, when two amateur historians, working in secret, followed those rumors into the forest. Using old maps, eyewitness accounts, and a bit of luck, they uncovered a shallow grave. Inside were bones, bullets, fabric, and the unmistakable evidence of a mass burial. They believed they had found the Romanovs. But the discovery was dangerous. If they reported it, they risked prison. So they reburied the site and kept the secret for nearly 10 years. Then, in 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the truth finally surfaced. Authorities reopened the forest. Archaeologists arrived. Cameras rolled. And soon, the first bones of the Romanov family were lifted from the ground. The remains were fragile, weathered, and incomplete, but unmistakably human. Still, one question overshadowed the discovery. Were these truly the Romanovs? To answer that, scientists turned to DNA testing, something impossible in earlier decades. Using samples from living relatives of the royal family, including Prince Philip of the United Kingdom, researchers compared mitochondrial DNA with the bones found in the grave. The results were clear. The remains belonged to Nicholas II, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. But the mystery wasn't over. 2 bodies were missing. This gap reignited the world's fascination with the Romanovs. Newspapers speculated that Alexei or Anastasia might have escaped. Hollywood revived the legend. Books and documentaries argued endlessly about who the missing children might be. For a moment, hope overshadowed history. But in 2007, a second burial site was discovered, just a short distance from the first. In that small grave were the charred, acid-damaged bones of 2 more children. DNA analysis again confirmed the truth. They were the last missing members of the Romanov family, Alexei and either Maria or Anastasia. The century-old mystery was finally resolved. The myths, the rumors, the stories of survivors, all came to an end. In 1998, the identified bodies of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughters were laid to rest in St. Petersburg with full state honors. Thousands gathered to witness what many saw as the closing chapter of a long and painful era. The burial of Alexei and his sister was delayed for political reasons, but their remains too were eventually recognized as authentic. Even today, debates continue about the exact sequence of events that night, and uncertainties remain about who gave the final order. But one truth stands above the rest. The Romanov family did not survive the revolution. Their bodies were not rescued. And their dynasty, once the most powerful in Russia, ended in silence beneath the forest floor. Yet their story lives on. In the legends they inspired. In the myths that refuse to die. And in the haunting question that still echoes more than a century later. Why did their murder need to be hidden for so long?